It's an honor, brothers, to have Dr. Renan Ferran with us today. And as we know that he's a professor at the AUK, American University of Kuwait. And inshallah he will talk a little bit about his book and how he got interested into the Arabic language, and then how this language led him to Islam. But I will just leave everything in the way he will explain it, inshallah. And before we start, just a quick introduction, as we do always, so everyone will know each other quickly, inshallah.
Well, thank you to the IPC. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about my favorite subject, the Qur'an, and sort of the literary approach to the Qur'an. And it was actually quite a long time in coming. I was in college as an English major, but I needed to have a job afterwards, so I had a ROTC scholarship, which sent me to the Navy. The Navy paid for my university education. In return, I had to serve a couple of years in the Navy. And during that time, I was sent for 1 year to the Middle East, to Egypt and Syria. And this was 1994. And this is when I first started taking private lessons, got really interested in the Arabic language. And my plan up until then had to go back, because I love literature. That's what I studied, was to go back to English graduate school. But because of this experience, I thought, well, maybe I can combine this English literature with Arabic literature. Maybe I could study comparative literature. So anyway, I returned to Washington and got out of the Navy in '97. And then with my savings, my Navy savings, I went back to the Middle East, to Egypt again, 2 years in Cairo, where I did an intensive Arabic language program. And gradually, I forgot about English literature, and I keep it as a hobby, but I got more and more engaged, more and more interested in Arabic. And this is what I decided to make my specialty. So then I left Egypt and then went to graduate school focusing on Arabic literature. And specifically, my real specialty is classical Arabic poetry and classical Arabic literature. Now, anyone, and I've spent 7 years there in California, anyone who works on classical Arabic literature has to deal with, of course, the fundamental text in Arabic, which is the Qur'an. And this is when I started reading the Qur'an, just to see why this is such a foundational text, why it's so important. Of course, it changes the whole morality from the pre-Islamic period, and then you have the revelation of the Qur'an, and the Islamic period, a lot changes. So I was studying the Qur'an, and from the beginning, I was just amazed at how the power and the beauty of the verses and how expressive they are, just from a literary perspective. Actually, extras. And then so this is my first introduction to the Qur'an from an Arabic literature perspective, from studying classical Arabic literature, and sort of being amazed by it and the beauty of it. And then I also got into sort of structural literary analysis of the Qur'an, also through studying Arabic literature. My dissertation is on classical Arabic poetry, and I was surprised, even though I was impressed with it, and of course heard so much of the Arabs praising their poetry, but many Western critics from the 19th century, from the 20th century, were actually saying about the old Arabic poems that they consist of beautiful individual lines, but there's no real connecting thread between lots of the lines. It's sort of as if the poems were haphazardly thrown together. And my dissertation is on something called ring composition, where, and some of the professors and others have, arguing against this, of course, showing the poems, these great poems, are not just hodgepodges put together, but there's very much of a pattern to the way the lines are interconnected. This is what my dissertation was on, and my main study in university was on. But then, after graduating and coming here to Kuwait, I was surprised to find that actually many of the same specialists in Arabic literature in the West, in the UK and in Germany and the States, are saying a lot of the same things about the Qur'an as the way it's put together as a book. Of course, this is the fundamental text of Islam, but they're saying it consists of surahs, but there's no pattern to way. why you have al-Fatiha, why you then have Surah al-Baqarah, why Al-Imran, and why do we end with the Mu'awwidhatayn, Surah al-Falaq, and Surah al-Nas. So having just sort of written a dissertation in a book on the classical Arabic poetry talking about the ring composition, how the poems are put together, and needing some other field to go into after that, well, I thought, well, why not start studying the Qur'an and focusing on that. Soon after that, I converted, and because studying the Qur'an, that's I guess a different story. But my focus here as an academic in Kuwait, in addition to teaching Arabic and teaching classes on classical Arabic poetry, has been really reading the Qur'an and looking at the organization of the Qur'an as a book, how it all holds together. And that I made this study. This is the Structured Quranic Interpretation, if you want to pass it around and look at it. Addresses the same topic, sort of as a building point for my study of Arabic poetry. And the main idea is that symmetry is the principle that holds together all the surahs and verses of the Qur'an. And you see three main forms of symmetry in the Qur'an. And if any of this is unclear, by all means stop me, or we can discuss more examples. But in the forms of symmetry, you see parallelism. Whereas if you divide a text in half, for example, in parallelism, if you see parallelism, there'll be the first half, maybe one section, and then going on to a new subject, you can call it A, B, and then the middle, in parallelism, the second half of the text will kind of be parallel to the first. So there'll be A and then A prime, we call it, which is a slight difference, maybe a thematic difference, but there's something similar to the first. And the fourth section is similar to the second. This is a structural way of parallelism. Opposite to that, a text can be put together by a form of chiasm, which is really, or it's also called the mirror pattern, because you start with one topic and then move to another topic and come to like the middle, and suddenly it's as if you're going towards the beginning again. The third topic will be similar to the second, and the fourth is then similar in some way to the first, and maybe you'll have a key word that sort of links you back to the beginning. So when you come to the end, you feel like the whole thing the circle has been completed. You've sort of been complete. The meaning has been completed. This is one form of symmetry, and then the one that seems to be most prominent, I mean, this is just an early study, and I'm still totally fascinated by it, but what seems to be most recurring as a literary form in the Qur'an is this pattern of concentrism, which is like the chiasm, where you will have one section and then move to a different section, but you have something in the middle that's unique. A unique element that doesn't seem to relate to anything else. It's just sort of centered and it's by itself there. And then after that, linking the fourth section is linked to the second, and the fifth section again is linked to the first. These seem to be the main patterns of symmetry that occur in the Qur'an on many levels. On the level of the verse, single verse, and sometimes in long verses, I think you can have this on the level of a couple words or phrases put together, but we can just talk about the level of verse. Also the level of a surah as a whole might show one of these patterns. And what I propose, that even the whole Qur'an is put together in a symmetrical sort of literary pattern, showing that it's all very cohesive and coherently put together. So I thought I would just point, and the book discusses different examples, but I thought I would just point to like 3 examples during this talk and then open it up to questions or comments. As an Iranian scholar has pointed out, in 2014, the Ayat al-Kursi, the throne verse, is an example in one verse of this last pattern of concentrism in Surah al-Baqarah. I guess read it first and then point out the patterns. Allah la ilaha illa huwa al-hayy al-qayyum. There is no God but God. the living, the eternal. لا تأخذه سنة ولا نوم. Slumber never overtakes him. له ما في السماوات وما في الأرض. All things in heaven and on earth belong to him. And then the rhetorical question, من ذا الذي يشفع عنده إلا بإذنه? Who may intercede with him except by his permission? يعلم ما بين أيديهم وما خلفهم. He knows what lies before his creatures and what lies behind them. ولا يحيطون بشيء من علمه إلا بما شاء. His creatures grasp nothing of his knowledge except by his permission. وسع كرسيه السماوات والأرض. His throne extends over the heavens and the earth. ولا يؤوده حفظهما. Supporting the heavens and the earth does not fatigue him. وهو العلي العظيم. He is the exalted, the great. So here you can see divided up in the first part of the verse the mention of God, and then two attributes of him, the living, the eternal. And then at the very end of the verse you again have two attributes. He is the exalted, the great. So it's as if you're coming back to the same sort of idea or structural idea. And then if you look at the second part of verse, لا تأخذه سنة ولا نوم. Slumber never overtakes him. He's always creating. He never tires or never takes a rest. Likewise, in the very second to the last part, supporting, holding up the heavens and the earth doesn't ever fatigue him. So he's never tired or fatigued. And then the idea that he, everything in the heavens and on earth belongs to him occurs in this third part. And the third to the last, that his throne extends over everything in the heavens and on earth. Sort of a similar type of idea. And then the two exceptions when you come closer to the middle. Who may intercede except by his permission? And then in D prime, his creatures grasp nothing of his knowledge except by his permission. إِلَّا بِمَا شَاءَ. Before إِلَّا بِإِذْنِهِ. And in the center of this verse, God's boundless knowledge. He knows what lies before his creatures, what's in front of them in the future, and what lies behind them, what's past, what they've done, what's in their past, and from the very beginning of the time. Just a short example of this pattern of symmetrical pattern of concentrism here obtaining on the level of one single verse. Is that clear?
Yeah, so am I right in saying what you're basically saying is there's a pattern of there's patterns on both sides. So if you like you've listed A, B, C, D, E, that's the one side and left side, and then the D, C, B, A, you're saying they're basically matching. The D's with the D's, the C's with the C's, and they have a link. There's a relationship between. And it's
A meaningful
Well, the idea is similar.
A meaningful relationship, a structural relationship. Here where you have the two attributes, the Hayy al-Qayyum, the living, the eternal, the very end, that's what you open with. The very end, al-Ali al-Azim, the exalted, the great. Exactly. So it's kind of like a pattern of similarity going to the very central element, which doesn't have any structural similarity. This is the very core, if you want to call it that, of the verse. So just analyzing the verse from a structural point of view, you see how it's symmetrical and balanced, and almost calling your attention to the very middle, where the I speaks of God's boundless knowledge, knowing what's all in front of his. It's as if here you can, imagine, or reading this verse, you can, as if God on his throne sees humankind coming towards him, and he knows everything before them, coming up to the very end of time. Likewise, he knows everything that's happened behind them, going back to the very beginning of time. His boundless knowledge. This is sort of the center of the verse.
In the literary world, is there a pattern that lends itself to more understanding or more human understanding? Is there a pattern above the other patterns that a human would grasp the meaning of more?
Interesting. Similarly, you do find something called ring composition or concentric patterns in classical Arabic poetry. And this is said early poetry was not written down, but it was memorized, and poets would memorize. And this is maybe a mnemonic device that helps you recall a poet when he recites a verse, and then a second verse, third verse, fourth, whatever, and gets to the middle, and then sort of remembers, okay, working your way back out of the poem. You find these similar patterns in stories, in poem literature, and it's definitely, you find them in Arabic literature. What differentiates the Qur'an is the amazing interconnection, the way it's so much more densely interconnected in verses, in long surahs, and seems to be surahs put together, and groups of surahs, and then all groups corresponding into 114 surahs that are all just linked by various patterns. So, I mean, that's, in my opinion, what clearly differentiates the Quran is just the amazing density of these interconnections and how tightly it's all woven together. And also that it was put together or revealed in 23 years in various circumstances to someone who was talking about a whole new religion, and then especially in the Medinan period, he was around the Prophet were all followers, and every day they were asking him questions about how to live and, of course, how to deal with the Meccans. So what's so amazing about the Quran, how is it all, if you can look at it from a literary angle, it's so interconnected and put together. How did this happen? Someone who obviously was busy 24 hours a day with other matters, but this was all just being revealed to him. In the end, it's all perfectly put together. So this is what I think studying the Quran, for me at least, it definitely strengthens my belief, or just in the Quran is a miracle. But these patterns do occur in in Arabic literature. So this is just one example. There are probably many others, especially in the long verses of this concentric pattern. But here you see in the Ayat al-Kursi, it seems to be put.
Pretty clear until now.
Okay. So then in another chapter of the book, I've taken this one example, I think, and these are not perfect. These are just my analyses, and they're open to question and clarification and can be improved on.
Poetry here, do you mean the surah or
Pre-Islamic poetry.
verses?
The classical Arabic poetry?
Yeah.
You
What do
can
mean
find
here poetry?
similar patterns. You can find
Verse or surah
No,
or
pre-Islamic
something.
Pre-Islamic poetry.
in the mu'allaqat, for example. I think you can find, at least I found, and others have found similar or similar concentric patterns where the poet will begin with an idea. For example, Imr al-Qais talks about in the very beginning huge rain, tears falling down. That the memories make him so sad, and he's talking almost a downfall of tears. And then in the middle of the poem he's encouraging himself how to get over this past beloved and finding hope in new possibilities in the future. And then at the end, there's a huge rainstorm. He sees this rainstorm coming down in central Arabia. And it seems to be there's a connection between the tears, the sadness, looking back on the loss in the past, and the rain promising hope in the future at the end of the poem. So maybe this is a connection, a thematic connection between the beginning and the end. And in the middle of the poem where he's really encouraging himself to get over this loss, and maybe there's hope in the future. This is a simple example of the same pattern, ring composition or concentrism in a pre-Islamic poem. That you have these same literary or symmetrical patterns occurring in the Qur'an, I believe, but of course in much more complicated or dense or interconnected ways.
So during that time, Quran, academically speaking, it was the biggest challenge to all the poets. Like
Yeah.
because of the density of the image.
And the power and the beauty of the Qur'an. And he was addressing poets who their specialty was memorizing poems and producing great language. But here the Qur'an was something so much more powerful and so extraordinary. That's, of course, why so many converted. But I think in general, the basic patterns, you can find similar patterns in pre-Islamic poetry and then in later poetry as well, but not to the same complexity. And of course, there are 114 surahs, and I just found what I think is an example of in Surah Al-Baqarah. And again, this is not a perfect analysis, but I put it out there. If other scholars or other people want to find maybe other examples or improve on these patterns, that's all the better, to something that's even more powerful connection. But I think you see the same pattern on the level of Surah Al-Baqarah, where in the very beginning of the surah you have the contrast between mu'mineen and the others, the disbelievers. And then at the very end of the surah, the believers are encouraged in their upcoming struggle. This was revealed before Ma'arakat Badr. The believers will be tested and they'll have to confront the disbelievers. And likewise, in verse, I think it's 20, I believe, or 21, the Prophet challenges believers, if you don't believe the Qur'an, if you don't believe that I'm inspired by God, well then come up with yourselves with a surah as powerful. And of course, no one comes up with one. Likewise, towards the end, Abraham, earlier prophet, challenges a disbelieving king. Well, if you disbelieve that God is the creator of the universe and he controls the moon and the sun, well then yourself, you're so powerful as a king, then why don't you change the way the sun rises and sets? And of course, he's not able to do that. And again, in the early part, it's mentioned that God gives life and he also will resurrect the dead. And we come back to this theme towards the end. So I think there's a connection between this first section, verses 1 to 39, and the last part of the Surah Al-Baqarah. And then you move on to a very long section, verses 40 to 123, dealing mostly with the children of Israel and Moses, delivering the law to the children of Israel. And of course, they disbelieve him. And the last example, they kill prophets and disbelieve Moses, who's in their presence, and he commands them, God has told you to sacrifice a cow. And they first ask him, well, how old should it be, an old cow or a young one? And he said, well, a young one. Okay, well, what color should this cow be? And a yellow, a beautiful cow. Well, what sort of work should this cow have performed during its lifetime? And then he tells them that, but they're really just, not. Here you have a prophet telling them that God has commanded you to sacrifice a cow, and they're asking all these questions and hesitating to obey him. I think corresponding to that is section where term B prime, where the Prophet Muhammad is delivering the law to the Muslims in Medina, just like Moses earlier delivered the law to the children of Israel. And here you have the children of Israel, I think, as a negative example. And unlike them, when the Prophet tells them the believers should obey what he says and follow God's word and enter Islam wholeheartedly. So I think there's a connection or correspondence between the second to last. And then Abraham was tested. He was told that he should sacrifice his son Ismail or Ishmael. Likewise, the Muslims will be tested in their belief later on against the kuffar, the disbelievers. And after he was tested, Abraham and Ismail built the Kaaba in Mecca. And in section C prime, there's instructions about the pilgrimage to Mecca. And just as there's a prayer earlier, Abraham and Ismail prayed that their descendants will one day submit to the one God. In section C prime, there's a warning not to go back after the Prophet Muhammad has come, and not to go back to worshipping the multiple gods of the pre-Islamic era. So I think you see correspondences between these various sections in Surah Al-Baqarah, that same sort of concentric pattern. And in the middle is the test of faith, where the Prophet tells them the new Qibla, the new prayer direction. Previously, in the early part, when the Prophet was in Mecca, the Muslims were praying in the direction of Jerusalem, just along the same direction as the Jews were praying. And then, of course, after the Hijrah, the Muslims move up to Medina, and suddenly the Prophet reveals the revelation, was revealed to him the revelation that the new Qibla is now going to be Mecca. So this is a test. Do you follow the Prophet now, face Mecca in your prayers, or continue praying towards Jerusalem with the Jews, or the Christians towards the east, towards the rising sun? This is a test of their belief. Do they follow him and obey God's commandment? And meanwhile, in the center of Al-Baqarah is the verse that says that all religious communities are called to compete in doing good deeds. And I think in the very exact center, وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا لِتَكُونُوا شُهَدَاءَ عَلَى النَّاسِ وَيَكُونَ الرَّسُولُ عَلَيْكُمْ شَهِيدًا. This is verse 143 out of 286 verses. In the very middle of the Surah Al-Baqarah, it says that God has made the Muslims the new middle community, the central community, to be an example to other communities in terms of doing good, doing what's right, and avoiding what's evil. I think this is an example of the amazing way the Qur'an is put together, that obviously this is, there's a reason that this is verse 143, the reference to the middle nation, the very middle of the longest surah in the Qur'an, Al-Baqarah. So this is an example of this pattern of concentrism working on the level of Surah Al-Baqarah. And what I propose in the book, and others have also pointed to similar pattern, the same pattern in other surahs. What I propose in the Qur'an and the book is that the Qur'an as a whole is also arranged. You can look at it with a similar concentric pattern, where there's an opening prayer, Al-Fatiha, and then thematically linked to that at the end you have the two prayers, Al-Mu'awwidhatani, Al-Falaq wal-Nas, the two prayers of refuge. And that there are 48 long surahs, longer ones from Al-Baqarah to Al-Hujurat, from Surah 2 to 49, corresponding to the 56 shorter ones, from Surah 57 going all the way to Al-Ikhlas 112. That these sort of balance or correspond to the longer ones beforehand. And the very central 7 surahs are, you have medium-length surahs revealed in Mecca that deal mostly with Judgment Day and the hereafter. This is something I propose, that if you look at the whole Qur'an, you see it also has this symmetrical overall pattern. And the very middle in Al-Qamar, numerical middle, Al-Qamar wa Rahman, you seem to have an emphasis on the two essential fundamental aspects of God that will be apparent to everyone on Judgment Day. God's awesomeness and how he will punish the disbelievers. It seems like this is really emphasized in Surah Al-Qamar with the stories, the 5 stories, the stories of Noah, the people of Noah who disbelieved and they were all drowned, the people of Ad who also disbelieved and they were killed by a wind, the people of Saleh who disbelieved their prophet Saleh and they were destroyed in a single tremendous blast. 1 second they were alive, next moment they were all dead. Then the people of Lot also disbelieved him and they were destroyed by a strong stone-bearing wind. And then the 5th story, the story of the people of Pharaoh who also were disbelievers and were drowned in the Red Sea. Even though this surah also mentions the aspect of God's mercy, it seems like the emphasis really is on these examples, these 5 stories of people who disbelieved and look what happened to them. On the one hand, I think this, on the other you have, then right after that, Ar-Rahman. which emphasizes again and again God's mercy and how those who believe will be rewarded with heaven, paradise afterwards. So I think in a structural level, maybe this is the very middle of the Qur'an, these two aspects. And the whole Qur'an is providing guidance. And of course, if we disbelieve, this is the punishment that will happen. And if we believe, this is the paradise that people will be rewarded with.
Are you saying those two surahs, do they fall into a type of parallelism, or rather in the middle? Is that how we use the term parallelism when there's two surahs that go hand in hand together?
Maybe you could look at them, yeah, two sort of paired, sort of parallel, two aspects, of course, of God. I think the two fundamental aspects, God's power and awesomeness of creating the world, and He also brought guidance. So the disbelievers are people who reject and either don't believe or don't care to listen or follow His way. And this is what's going to happen to them eventually, just as it happened to all these earlier peoples. So the God aspect of God's awesomeness and how, of course, He'll punish the disbelievers, paired with His other essential attribute, His incredible mercy, that He'll forgive the people who try to do what's right and follow Him and believe.
Which two surahs was it? Qamar and Rahman.
In the previous page, what I outline I think there's a pattern between the prayer in the beginning, the two prayers at the end, and then the long surahs grouped in a specific order for a good reason put there. They're balanced by the shorter ones in the last part of the Qur'an. So you know the surahs get shorter and shorter. And then 50 beginning with Qaf and ending with al-Waqi'ah. These 7, they're all Meccan surahs. They're about 55 verses long. I think they go from like 48 to 98, roughly this length. But on average, they're about 50 to 60 verses long. And it seems like thematically their main focus is on the afterlife, mentioning what hell is going to be like, and also with verses that discuss the punishments, and also verses discussing paradise. And I think in the sort of the middle of these, maybe you have 50 to 54, it's like a first 4, and then a central 2, and then a Waqi'ah, the longest one, corresponding to the earlier 4. This is what I propose anyway, that Al-Qamar wa Rahman are sort of structurally the center of these 7. And even it seems at the end of Al-Qamar is linked to the very beginning, the 55th verse of في مقعد صدق عند مليك مقتدر, that the believers at the end of time will be in a seating place of truth, عند مليك مقتدر, in the presence of a magnificent sovereign. And people there, many of the Mufassirin have talked about, it's amazing that it's talking about, here it's nekira, indefinite noun, that the whole surah ends on an indefinite noun, that these people, the believers at the end, will be in the presence of a magnificent sovereign. It's almost as if one of the Mufassirun pointed that it's almost at the end of Al-Qamar is just pointing to the beginning of Ar-Rahman. Who is this, where we ask, who is this omnipotent, all-powerful, sovereign King Ar-Rahman? The answer is the very beginning of Ar-Rahman. So it's like there's almost a connection there between the end of Al-Qamar and the beginning of Ar-Rahman. The amazing connections in the Qur'an, Nazm al-Qur'an, which is something that the people of Muslim scholars have been talking about since the 9th century or 8th century and before, is really, it's, i'jaz, the amazing, miraculous way it all holds together, is a fascinating subject. And is that clear? Any question?
So in a way, you've connected. I guess, from a literary standpoint, you've almost visioned it as chapters, and then the chapters have their own particular story. But then these chapters somehow still coalesce into one idea, right? Sort of like that, huh?
Exactly. Yeah. And the basic idea is that every verse is like, there's a reason why the verse begins here and ends here. Every verse is like a small unit, and then every surah itself is a larger unit. It's a complete whole. There are, of course, in Fatiha, one prayer, one complete, perfect, total prayer, or a surah, and Baqarah, one long, very long surah, 286 ayahs, but it all holds together as one comprehensive whole. And then the idea is then also 114 surahs are all put together in a certain way that in the end they all hold together as one book, one Qur'an. And if you tried moving any surah into a different place, there's a reason why there's this order, and they belong in this order. And it's
So the biggest challenge why a human, it's impossible for them to form such a text is because particularly of this connection? Or are there more points? I mean, there are many miracles, but in your opinion, what did you find top 3?
this is what I think the literary analysis of the Quran, literary analysis, is really asking the question, why do we begin with Al-Fatiha? Why do we end with Al-Nas? Why do we come to Al-Baqarah after that? And so forth. And so why reach, and then just sort of analyze, and talking, and in the classical period, Al-Biqai, in the 8th century or 9th century of Al-Hijrah, he has a whole tafsir that's about 10 volumes. That he discusses every single verse, how this one naturally leads into the next, and at the end of every surah.
Links between the surahs.
Exactly, yeah. How this last ayah is a perfect end to the surah, and how it also takes us right into the next. So this is sort of an old way of looking at the Quran, and I guess it's some newer, the literary new aspects. These older mufassirin are more interested in where do we divide up? Yes, there are 286 verses. Can we divide up? Is there a particular part, and then do we move on to a different subject? And then there's a middle subject. How do these various parts hold together to make one whole that's, of course, stronger than all its parts? It's meant to be like that, and that the structure emphasizes a certain central message. So it's kind of a development of an old way of looking at the Quran.
So what I meant to say is for a human to channel this or have that idea. For example, if I start writing a paragraph and I write 3 paragraphs, I'll have to, if I follow this pattern, it'll be impossible for me. I'm going to keep making mistakes because I cannot relate every line, and then on the whole I cannot relate every paragraph, right? That's where I'll run into a big huge problem, right?
Yeah.
If I were to
something
have
that's
an attempt.
magnificent and powerful, and I think this is the challenge in 10 times in the Quran. The Prophet is saying, if you're a disbeliever, he's telling these poets and others, come up with some surah, or come up with 10 surahs that are this powerful and this beautiful, and of course no one ever does. And then of course, the greatest miracle of all in this sense is the whole Quran, 114 of them, each one all held together and tied together so well, exactly to someone who we don't have any record of the Prophet being the most eloquent person in Mecca, just amazing people with his power and his eloquence before he turned age 40. He was a merchant, and taking trips up to Syria and then coming back and interacting with people. But suddenly he starts coming forward with this, something that in Arabic literature, anyone who studies, whether they're focusing on the Quran or not, if you ask them what's the most eloquent piece or eloquent work or book, and the poets themselves will say, of course, the Quran is inimitable. You can't match it.
People have tried, in in the recent history, I think Furqan is a book which they tried to have an attempt to do similar verses. I don't know if you know about the attempts which people have done, humans have done in history.
Yeah, I think I know there have been a couple attempts where people have said they can match it,
Yeah.
and then people compare, and there's no comparison.
I thought did you go through them or?
Not so much. I mean, I've really been focusing on reading and
No.
studying the Qur'an from. I mean, there's a story that Mutanabbi supposedly claimed that, although I don't actually believe that story. But
The poet Mutanabbi.
yeah. Well, there's wondering why he was imprisoned in his youth, and some people say that he actually said that he's a prophet. But in one of his poems, he's comparing himself to Saleh. That he's trying to tell people, trying to rouse them up and preach, showing a message to them, and no one's listening to him. So he compares himself. My situation is like this poet. I think this is why he was called, anyway, the one who would be a poet. But there's a story that comes later that he actually, said he could produce a Qur'an. I don't think it's a true story. But, yeah, so you have such a powerful work coming from someone who has no background, who never claimed to be the most eloquent person, suddenly produces this Qur'an. And during 23 years, where he's interacting with people on a daily basis, leading them in prayers, then leading them to Medina. To me, this is the biggest miracle. And suddenly it all comes together, as you know, the very last اليوم أتممتم. This verse only was revealed in the 23rd year, only 3 months, in في حجة الوداع, only 3 months before the Prophet died. So it all is perfectly put together in this life that is a life filled with, he was out there fighting in the battles, Badr, Khandaq, so you have this book that's a literary miracle from someone who has no literary background, and it all comes together as a perfect whole right when he's at the end of, when Mecca has been freed and cleared out of the idols, and most of Arabia has submitted to Islam. It just seems like an amazing. Couldn't have happened all this way if it wasn't God behind it all.
You pointed out here the concentration in the Quran as a whole. From my understanding, and my knowledge is not so great, so those can correct me if I'm wrong. The compilation was compiled by the time of Hazrat Usman radiallahu anhu, is that correct? So would you say that's also a miracle in terms of how it was compiled? Because had it not been compiled like that, would it have still had a concentration in such order as a whole?
Sorry, but I think there's an issue. There's the compilation of the book, but the Prophet ﷺ in the last Ramadan recited it in this order already.
Oh, right,
So this is a mistake that Muslims make,
okay.
that they think the Quran was not like this in the time of the Prophet ﷺ.
It was on like parchments and stuff,
Yeah.
so it was in existence
But-
and it was in order as well. He just compiled them into one book, and the rest of the parchments they were all destroyed.
But the order was recited
Sorry.
by the Prophet ﷺ during the last Ramadan.
So verbally it was always in order,
That
Yeah.
order.
but it's just a physical
Yes.
compilation that took. Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So he recited a complete.
This is correct, right?
Twice the year that he died, in this order. But I have heard there are ahadith, of course, in ahadith you can find differences, but there are some ahadith that say that, of course, he said that each surah, this is the order of all 100, of course, Al-Fatiha, these 7 ayahs in this order, and Al-Baqarah, the 286 verses exactly in this order. I have heard a hadith that said the actual Uthmanic committee later, after his death, 18 years, decided on the way the surahs are put together. So there are contradiction in some of the hadith, but I personally I think the nazm of the Qur'an, the way it's put together, and especially that you find some of the same patterns in the verses and in the surahs, and the way the surahs themselves are put together. that's showing it's the same agency. I mean, if you think the Quran was inspired, then it says he was told, the Prophet was told that this is the order. So I think, in my opinion, a literary study of the Quran, the structure of the Quran, leads me to believe that whether or not it was all written down during his lifetime, certainly the order was set. That it should be starting with the Fatiha, Al-Baqarah, Al-Imran, Imran, Al-Ma'idah, and Nisa and Ma'idah, in this order exactly as we have it today.
Excuse me, this all the verses revealed at a particular time, either in Makkah or Medina, during the Prophet whole 23 years.
Right.
What you study or got this Surah Baqarah, the biggest one, Surah.
Right.
All the whole 286 ayat revealed at the same time.
I think they're asbab and nuzul. It's possible that the other verses, it's certainly a Medinan surah, and certainly most of it was revealed right after the Hijrah to Medina. And this was between 622 Miladiyya and 624. 622 is the year of the Hijrah, and 624 is the year of the first battle of Badr, the miraculous victory against the Kafir. And much of the surah deals with the new Qibla. Now that the Muslims have moved up to Medina, the new Qibla is now Mecca. But it's possible that later aspects, I mean, there's much in Surah Al-Baqarah, there's talk about divorce and Hajj and bequests when you die, this is how you should leave. Maybe some of these verses were revealed later during the Medinan period. Of course, the Prophet was there from 622, and then he died in 632. So 9 to 10 years. So you might have a few verses here and there revealed later during that period, but the majority of it seems to be, if not the vast majority, in the same time period. This is...
You mentioned tafsir earlier. What was it called? This was about the structure of the Quran as well.
And
تفسير البقائي دلالة البرهان في تناسق القرآن or something like this.
Yeah. Suyuti has a short book on Nazm al-Quran, but the one who really goes into the most depth is al-Baqai.
But I think also in Dalal al-Quran, Sayyid Qutb, he mentions in the beginning of every surah how the surah goes, the flow of the surah. But he didn't really go through in depth in how these structures are together. But it would make a lot of efforts easier if we look at the beginning of every surah, the way he mentioned it, and then put what your study in, and then it can help in a lot of surahs.
So combine or compare?
Yeah.
Of course, he was a great literary scholar, and then he became, later, did fi Dalal al-Quran, the great tafsir.
Yeah.
And it's such a sensitive, such an important, wonderful reading of the Quran. And he does a lot of this, dividing it up into different, or like mihwar for each surah. And this is really, I think, a growing field that, I mean, he, of course, Sayyid Qutb made great strides in explaining the Quran and how each surah is put together in the different passages, different parts. And hopefully we can get to a clearer, and there are people differ on these, but I think you can at least agree on main divisions, and hopefully enough people agree that there's a consensus. Well, this particular section deals with one topic, then we move to another topic. Because I think it helps for understanding sort of the flow of the Quran.
Yeah. Doctor, what would you suggest in terms of on a daily basis a structure? Because in our culture and the Indian South Asian continent, it's more emphasis is given on the reading of the Quran and and the rituals. But regarding the understanding, there's very poor lack of there in that section. So on a daily basis, like one way is you go to academically, you join a university. But on a daily basis, day to day, how do you suggest we get into understanding? Should we learn Arabic as a language first and then? So if you can give me a few points on, in your opinion, what can be the best approach?
Definitely. I mean, Arabic is hopefully it's such a long process, and I mean, I guess I've been doing it since '97. So definitely, yeah, it's a lifetime endeavor. And it's such a rich, beautiful language that you always feel like there's more to learn, and that will obviously enhance your appreciation, understanding of the Qur'an. I've always loved the translation of Abdullah Yusuf Ali. I think he's an Indian scholar himself, but his English translation is really excellent, and he also has lots of notes below that sort of about the. He talks about the structure and also background notes about the different prophets that are mentioned, and a lot of references to where this idea is mentioned in other surah. It's helped me a lot to understand. This is really the way I've been studying the Quran, reading the Arabic, and then he has the English translation right there with lots of notes. And also, I think starting with the Meccan surahs, the shorter ones at the back, are easier to handle if you have 20 verses or 9 verses or 7 or 6. I mean, these also are individual units. I think Surah for example, 112, it's not here, Ikhlas. One can look at that one. It's only 4 verses. But likewise, I think it shows a sort of a parallel pattern. Anyway, one can sort of analyze the way the different parts. Here in a very short verse, Al-Kawthar, you can see how is it put together, how is it one meaningful whole. If you're interested in studying sort of the way the Quran is put together, this is a good starting way, using a translation with the Arabic, and then also studying the language.
Doctor, I mean, like while you were speaking, I went on Surah Al-Ghashiyah. I was trying to implement what you were saying, and it was so very easy to see the structure and how it's like parallel or like a mirror. In the beginning, it speaks about the hereafter, هل أتاك حديث الغاشية وجوه يومئذ خاشعة, and then it speaks about the signs. أفلا ينظرون إلى الإبل كيف خلقت وإلى السماء كيف رفعت. And then at the end, إن إلينا إيابهم وإن إلينا علينا أو إن إلينا إيابهم وإن علينا حسابهم. So it speaks about the akhirah also. Again.
And it starts with this and then.
And this.
Yeah. It's beautiful, and these are. I mean, I hope the diagrams are. These are just sort of simple.
So there are other examples in your book.
There are other ones, and yeah, these are really. There's some in the back, but I think there's room for so much more work on this. The long ones, like Al-Baqarah, this took me the first 2 years. I was really, or 2 or 3 years, and I'm still sort of wondering about it. And it's only sort of like a macro view of the structure, but you can go into more depth. But we can start with the shorter ones, and to me, it just adds to the appreciation and the amazement of the Quran. You see the way it's put together like this. And yeah, I think before Al-Ghashiyah you have Al-A'la. And even there's the mention of the great fire, that those who tajannab, they will be in the Nar al-Akbar. And I think this is then taken up in Al-Ghashiyah, it's sort of the beginning of it's mentioned, and at the end. So yeah,
I think they should do more like research and PhD, like special PhD research on this, like on certain surahs and how they go on the same like sequence.
Yeah,
I think it's a good idea.
I think it's and to me it's interesting academically, and when I see something like this, sometimes wow, amazing, subhanAllah. It's the beauty of it, or just the aesthetic beauty, or the power, how it's all so, tightly put together or beautifully interconnected. It's, yeah.
Just regarding the connection for one surah to the next, is this consistent throughout the Qur'an? The connection, one follows the other, with some idea or concept from one to the other?
I think so. And I propose, I start out talking about many of the critics, Western critics, mostly in the last 19th and 20th century, have talked about the Quran as an incoherent, not well put together book. And then I point to what I think are important principles, and I think initially that every individual surah is a complete, a whole. And it's put together in a coherent way, it belongs that way, and you can't add to it and you can't subtract to it. And then I think you have examples of many surahs that are pairs. Just like in the what I think is the center, Al-Qamar, or Rahman. These two surahs are right next to each other and they belong together. One emphasizes God's awesomeness, His power, and how He's going to punish the disbelievers. The other emphasizes His mercy and how He's going to forgive the believers. And I think there are many examples of surahs that are 2 and 3, 4 and 5 that they belong as pairs. And then on a larger level, I think you have many surahs or surah pairs that also are joined together. You have a larger section of like surah groups, which right. Maybe 2 to 5 seem like they belong. Many of them deal with the new laws to the Muslims. They were revealed about the same time. And then when you go to Surah Al-An'am, Surah 6, it's like you're going to a Meccan surah. It's like moving to a different type group or something. So a selection of surahs that all sort of also are put together as a larger whole. And then I think it seems like the long surahs also kind of, in a broad sense, hold together, and the shorter ones towards the end also tied together. I think one can contemplate an individual verse, a whole surah, a surah pair, several surahs put together, and then even large sections of the Quran. And then going back to always the question, how could one person just put all this together at different times, different places, in different circumstances, and then at the end it all comes together, all so unified. It's
interesting because as I hear you talk, it just reminds me of the Quran and how Allah, it created everything from the smallest thing to the biggest things in the universe, and the systems. So when you're talking about how in the Quran it goes from the smallest to the whole, it actually reminds me of the Quran and things that are mentioned in the Quran, and it reflects. It's almost like the structure is an example, of Allah's creation. I mean, it is Allah's creation, but I'm saying like the way it's put together, it's almost it's another example of how things have been put together. It's a metaphor.
Yeah.
So even and if you think about it, the regular human being doesn't see this.
Right.
So it's like it's put together in a way that only people who are scholars get to see this, but it was put together no matter what. Right. If you're really thinking about someone who's a writer, it'll be it will be a great effort to do this when the majority of people will never actually get this, but it's there.
Yeah. I think similar like a doctor who can see how all the parts of the body function together as one whole creation. Likewise, or how all different species are all interconnected. on Earth, or even on a greater level, the solar system or universe.
Yeah, like ecosystems and solar systems and
Mhm.
galactic systems. And
Yeah.
Yeah, I think in a miniature way, as a text or a book, the same principles are.
Mhm.
I believe Allah Himself, He says in Surah Al-Qamar, وَلَقَدْ يَسَّرْنَا الْقُرْآنَ لِلذِّكْرِ فَهَلْ مِن مُدَّكِرٍ. So He Himself has proclaimed that it is easy. I guess a few points is the correlation, then the rhythm, and then the tune, how it ends. Every surah is characteristically different. So I guess all these points make it very easy even for kids to memorize the whole book at
Yeah.
a very young age. I think there's no other book which has been memorized, right? So I think that verse in Qamar where you said it's the center,
Yeah,
proclaiming to humans and all creation that it's easy. Right?
maybe these familiar patterns make it easy, or sort of the parallelisms or repeats of different ideas, but there's sort of the ending of a verse, it sounds similar to the other ending, or this probably helps in memorizing and reciting.
Yeah, and it's in the memorization in Arabic. So obviously the parallels exist in the written part in English or any other language when it comes to thematic. But when it comes to memorization, it will be extremely hard to memorize the Quran in English as in comparison to memorizing the Quran in Arabic. And this happened to me once I started memorizing the Quran. I was living in the United States. I have no knowledge of Arabic. But as I started memorizing the Quran, it became easier to memorize more Quran. So, I think probably this rhythms, you start building them.
Yeah,
So, eventually
internalizing them.
yeah, and also the more you memorize, the more I memorized, the more I could memorize in the same period of time. So when I started, I could just do one line, and then eventually, 2-3 lines every day. So also as you start, and again, it's not any particular method, because I know that, like some of the people who are really memorizing, there's methods for it. But with no particular method, just by memorizing Quran, it was easier to memorize more Quran.
Mhm.
And I think
Wow.
that's another layer of a miracle of the Quran itself.
Yeah.
So this also seems to explain some of that.
And there's a book by عبد الرزاق نوفل الإعجاز العددي في القرآن الكريم. It's written in like نوفل.
No.
This is in like 1986 الإعجاز العددي في القرآن, the numerical miraculous nature of the Quran. And he goes through many words like الدنيا والآخرة, something like that. I'm not sure if this is an example, but he finds the dunya will be mentioned, let's say, I don't
How
know,
many times it was mentioned?
135 times, مثلا. And al-akhirah is mentioned the exact number of times. And there he has about 15 or 16 different examples of this.
Yeah, I've heard of some of these.
The man and male and female, each one is mentioned 12 times, exact balance. Another, how can someone put this all together?
And in different places also, and in
Yeah.
different surahs and different.
Over 600 pages.
Yeah.
600 pages, 6,000 verses, etc.
And you wouldn't notice it because each one belongs in its place. It's not like you come to the end and here all, each one is perfectly situated in its verse.
True.
But if you, look at it from that perspective, then you suddenly realize the numbers are all exactly balanced.
I think similar like a paradise, the hellfire, something like all together. I think yes. I remember I read something about it also, even how many times water is mentioned and how many times is like al-ard or something like that, and it's exactly the same combination of the body or of the earth. Like we know that like 75%
How much of the
water and like 25% is all the. So subhanallah. So exactly it was mentioned the same way as in our body and as the earth, as the word. So yeah, it's a miracle. Yeah.
There are more and more
You go deep.
indications. Yeah.
Yeah, true. SubhanAllah. Alhamdulillah.
To me, personally, it's amazing. The literary evidence is just really
True. Alhamdulillah.
amazing.
So if you're done, inshallah,
I
we
can continue, or if there,
up to you. I thought
I
we
will
were-
probably.
No. It's okay. We're just sitting, and at the end, we'll just have the dinner.
I think the last bit was just how the Fatiha seems like a perfect thematic and structural introduction to the Quran. But maybe we've talked about a lot. It seems like we don't need to go into that. It's just
Exactly. I actually personally prefer, and inshallah we can ask the brothers, that we can have the dinner. Lunch is gone. The dinner. And while we're having dinner, we can just go with the question and answer session. And the first question I would like to ask that, okay, you started learning Arabic and you was not a Muslim at that time, but you were just maybe interested in learning Arabic and everything. So where was the turning point for you that you was like, wow, okay, now this could be the miracle. So we would like to hear that once we start, having the dinner. If you have any other questions, but I really would like to know how the doctor, where was the turning point of the doctor?
sure.
So